just a minute in hopes we draw a crowd. We're more than satisfied with the crowd, so perhaps we can begin. The mic is working okay? Yeah. Welcome to the fifth and last session of the first Macalester International Roundtable on the topic of the international community and the emerging world order or disorder. It's both an advantage and a challenge to be on the very last panel. The advantage is, as Professor Dorothy Dodge pointed out at lunch yesterday, that we can build on everything that has been done so far. And the risk, of course, is, as she also pointed out, that everything important has already been said. I told Professor Dodge that might be a risk if this were an ordinary panel, but given the quality of this panel, there was nothing to worry about. The order of the proceedings will be the same as in all the previous panels. I will first introduce the participants. My name, incidentally, is Ellis Dye. I'm chair of German and Russian at Macalester. Next, Professor Yoshikazu Sakamoto will present his paper entitled The Long Transformation for a Democratic World Order. We will then have the usual 20-minute coffee break that I suppose you're accustomed to by now. A coffee will be available outside and downstairs, I believe. Then we will return to this room and have the responses. Professor Sakamoto's paper will last about 50 minutes and the responses about 18 minutes each. After that, we will have 45 minutes of general discussion in which the main speaker and the respondents will take questions from the floor. And if you've not been present in previous sessions, look in both aisles. You will see microphones, and please address your questions through the microphones. And insofar as possible, we will try to alternate back and forth from one mic to the other. It is now my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Yoshikazu Sakamoto. Professor Sakamoto is a senior research fellow at the Peace Research Institute at the International Christian University in Tokyo and a professor emeritus of the University of Tokyo. He is a leading world figure in the fields of international politics and peace and world order studies. And as such, Professor Sakamoto is the author of numerous books and articles in both Japanese and English, including Conditions of Global Democracy, 1991, Japan in the Age of Globalization, also 1991, those in Japanese, and Asia, Militarization and Regional Conflict, a book of which he is the editor in 1988, The Emperor System as a Japan Problem in 1989, and Global Transformation, which is forthcoming. He has been director of the World Order Models Project since 1986 and is the recipient of two famous prizes, the Yoshino Sakuzo Prize in 1966 and Ishibashi Tanzan, 1989, Publications of the Year prizes in both cases. In addition, he is on the editorial boards of the Journal of Peace Research, Alternatives, and Interdisciplinary Peace Research. In 1991, he was a visiting professor of peace studies at the University of Oregon. His most recent paper, The Role of Japan in the Future International System, outlines three models of Japan's role in the international system that will determine the global context of post-Cold War Asia. Welcome, Professor Sakamoto. Gretel Figueroa, a Macalester student, was born in the United States, but her parents came to the United States in 1970 from Guatemala. Although she was born in this country, her ties to Guatemala are still very strong, as she often travels to visit family living there, and most recently to do field work on land tenure patterns and sharecropping. She has been fortunate to have traveled other places as well, including Japan, France, and Madagascar, where she spent last spring semester this year. She is fluent in Spanish and French. She is a senior majoring in economics, anthropology, and international studies. She is planning to use development from her studies and travels, to use knowledge from her studies and travels in order to pursue a career in development via graduate school in either agricultural economics or international studies. Welcome, Gretel. Serap Mamatli is a reporter for Aktuel in Istanbul, Turkey, where she writes about international events and new global trends, as well as current political and social affairs in Turkey. She holds a master's degree in Ottoman history from Bosphorus University in Istanbul and a bachelor's degree in political science from Middle East Technical University in Ankara. She has also worked as a reporter for two Turkish economics weeklies, Ekonomist und Ekonomik Panorama. In addition to being a journalist, Mamatli, that is Serap Mamatli, a native of Niğde, is a professional tourist guide licensed by the Turkish Ministry of Tourism. She has ambitions when she feels more seasoned as a journalist to become a columnist. And in a dinner conversation, she revealed to me that one of the first columns she wants to write about is American suspicion of government and hostility toward government in the press, which gives me an opportunity to tell a joke that has been circulating around this conference. I hope it hasn't got to you yet. I heard it from a trustee of the college, Mary Vaughn, who heard it from another trustee, Ken Gilmore, who says that it originated inside the Clinton White House. It is an expression of paranoia inside the Clinton White House. The joke goes like this: President Clinton and the Pope are out fishing, and the Pope's line gets snagged on a log some 30 feet from the boat. Clinton climbs out of the boat, walks across the water and unties the snag, comes back to the boat, they go on fishing. The next morning, the headline in the newspaper reads, "Bill Clinton can't swim." Welcome, Serap. Professor Yu Him Tam is a professor of history and director of East Asian Studies at Macalester. He has his PhD from Princeton University, where he specialized in modern Japanese intellectual history and Sino-Japanese cultural interactions. His major books include Studies on Modern Sino-Japanese Cultural Relations, 1986, and The Japanese Textbook Problem, to be published in Hong Kong. His current research is on Pan-Asianism as a dimension of modern intellectual history and Sino-Japanese translation as cultural history. He is a founding member of the Committee on Sino-Japanese Studies, the Association and the Association for Asian Studies in the USA. He is also the executive director of the Chinese Association for Japanese Historical Studies and director of the Chinese Association for Studies of Sino-Japanese Relations. Welcome, Professor Tam. We will now hear from Professor Sakamoto. If you have been present at earlier sessions, you know that all of the main speakers at this conference have been asked to do various things. To foreground the sense of each of them of the nature of this time of transition and globalization. They were asked to pose from their own individual perspective the critical global questions that seem to be driving the world into the 21st century, and to make suggestions on how we are to treat, that is, to think and act on those questions. And finally, to identify the social forces, groups, or states that must come together to make the transition less destructive and more advantageous to all. Professor Sakamoto answers this charge in a subtly reasoned survey and analysis of history that is at once panoramic and incisive. It is subtle and complex, and it will require your attention. And if you pay close attention, you will be richly rewarded.
The paper I have prepared is too long to be presented within the time limit of 45 or 50 minutes. So I've decided to skip most of the historical analysis, which I think will not be the main focus of your interest here. But I did it because I found several weak points in my argument. So it's better not to expose these weak points and I shall be less vulnerable to the criticism that will follow my presentation. The post-Cold War world has witnessed, in my view, the following four fundamental developments, all of which are unprecedented in history. First, the emergence of unipolar world military order centered on the United States as the hegemonic global military power. It must at the same time be noted that the military superiority or even supremacy of the United States, challenged by no comparable contender, by no means implies that the United States is militarily omnipotent. The United States is incapable of putting Bosnia, Serbia, Liberia, Somalia, or Rwanda under its military control, let alone Iran, Iraq, North Korea, and so forth. No doubt the United States is at the top of the world military pyramid, but it is incapable of keeping all stones beneath in order. This is probably a consequence not so much of the limits of US military power as of the limits to military power as such, particularly in the contemporary world characterized by the following other three developments. Secondly, the emergence of a single capitalist market economy on a global scale. It is true that since the 16th century, the various regions of the world began to be incorporated by European powers into the capitalist world system. In the 1960s, however, the Soviet Union, where the post-war reconstruction was well underway, proclaimed that the world consisted of the two economic systems, the socialist system having encompassed the Comecon countries and having attained parity and independence vis-à-vis the capitalist system. Now, with the collapse of the socialist system, the world as a whole began to constitute a single capitalist market economy for the first time in history. Thirdly, the universalization of nationalism. It goes without saying that nationalism, which originated in the West of modern times, spread to non-Western societies, taking the form of anti-Western nationalism, which culminated in the massive decolonization and national liberation movements in Asia, Latin America, and Africa in the post-World War II period. Paradoxically, the Soviet Union, which originally served as a source of ideological inspiration for the colonial peoples engaged in the struggle against Western imperialism, turned out to be a deconsolidated Russian empire. In the aftermath of World War II, the empire extended to Eastern Europe. In the course of the collapsing of the Soviet Empire, nationalism, which had historically prevailed in the West and then in the Third World, spread to the last empire, giving rise to the eruption of ethno-nationalist demands of captive nationalities of the former USSR. For the first time in history, nationalism has been universally put into effect. Fourthly, the globalization of democracy. Policies and movements for democratization were persistently obstructed by anti-democratic forces, even in the so-called advanced countries such as 19th century Britain and France. When the three democratic powers, Britain, France, and the United States, laid the groundwork for the Versailles settlement, the system was to be challenged by two counterforces. Fascism in Germany, Japan, and Italy staged a frontal attack on democracy, rejecting it as illegitimate, unworkable, and/or corrupt. State socialism of the Soviet Union opposed Western democracy by proclaiming that proletarian democracy was genuinely democratic, while bourgeois democracy was a fake. While fascism was openly anti-democratic, state socialism was ostensibly or officially pro-democratic, as illustrated by the language they used, such as people's democracy, democratic centralism, and so on. And even North Korea, which is considered to be non or anti-democratic by many people, have the name, as you know, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. As a result of the demise of the fascist Axis powers in 1945, and after the demise of state socialism, the authoritarian regimes of developing countries must at least rhetorically, at times apologetically, acknowledge through the promise of election and transfer of power to civilian government that the authoritarian system is a transition device necessitated by the economic development requirements of a less developed country, which will ultimately turn out into a democracy. Or they may acknowledge that although Western model of democracy does not fit the social cultural conditions of the country, they will develop a democracy of their own model. And this is the argument, I think, used by China today. This makes a sharp contrast with the Nazis or the Japanese militarists, who never held the view that they were democracies of their own model, nor that their regimes were a transition step towards ultimate democratization. Today, anti-democracy cannot claim legitimacy in its own right. In short, the post-Cold War world democracy has gained universality for the first time in history. We have identified four global trends: unipolarization of world military order, globalization of the capitalist market economy, universalization of nationalism, and globalization of democracy. These four trends can be considered to be the manifestation of two deeper processes of global change. The first two, unipolarization of world military order and globalization of the capitalist market economy are the reflections of the trend toward internationalization. That is, these two refer to the process which cuts across the national boundaries, transcending and eroding the nation-state system. The latter two reflect the deeper process of democratization. That is, the universalization of nationalism refers to the trend toward international equality or equality of nations, and the globalization of democracy is the manifestation of the struggle for and the establishment of the equality of universal human rights. The first refers to horizontal widening, the latter to vertical deepening. What are these more fundamental dynamics of change? My view is that underlying the historical change in the modern times are the fundamental contradictions on the following three dimensions, in terms of which major conflicts and changes in modern history can be accounted for. They are, first, capitalism versus socialism; two, state nationalism versus internationalism; and three, democracy versus authoritarianism. By modern history, I refer to the period since the latter half of the 18th century, when these contradictions became increasingly prominent as the result of the interrelated emergence of industrial capitalism, political nationalism, and liberal democracy in major Western advanced countries such as Great Britain, France, and the United States. Further, it is not only the contradictions on these three dimensions, but also the uneven development of the contradictions and their components that generated complex dialectics of modern history. Nationalism and democracy, as well as capitalism, developed unevenly. Early starter capitalism gave rise to metropoles, domination of the periphery. Early starter state nationalism led to imperialism vis-à-vis colonized peoples, and early starter democracy generated international ideological conflict in terms of human rights, such as what we saw in the relationship between the US and USSR, and now US and China. It is these three countries, Britain, France, and the United States, that, despite significant variations, consisted of the essentially common structural complex of capitalism, nationalism, and democracy, and acted as the early starter developed countries in the world of last centuries. These three countries constituted what I would call the core bloc, which by the middle of the 19th century definitively began to play the role of the engine of global transformation, setting the rule of development and underdevelopment for the rest of the world. To counteract the impact of the early starter core bloc, Germany, Japan, and Italy began in the latter half of the 19th century to catch up with the core bloc by remolding their structure in pursuit of the complex consisting of capitalism, nationalism, and authoritarianism. This model aimed at building a strong capitalist state at the expense of democracy. This CNA model, capitalism, nationalism, authoritarianism model, was a reaction of late starter developed empires to the core bloc empires, that is CND empires. And the contrast between the two models suggests that capitalism and nationalism can develop in combination with authoritarianism, not necessarily with democracy, and that the most crucial distinction between the early starter empires and the late starter empires is the presence or absence of political democracy. The war between the CND bloc and CNA group took the form of World War I and World War II. And in the course of World War II, the CND bloc, namely the so-called United Nations, and won the war, and the CNA Axis was defeated. It was a defeat not only militarily, but political and ideological. The CNA model bloc challenged the dominant international system of CND bloc and failed. Furthermore, the international system of CNA states, internal system of CNA states was changed as a result of the defeat. The CND bloc transformed the CNA camp by changing A into D, authoritarianism into D, democracy, and that was called democratization and demilitarization of the CNA regime, which was thereby incorporated into the Western Bloc. The Japan, Germany, Italy were all incorporated into CND bloc. The post-World War II world was polarized into two blocs, one headed by the CND core bloc, the other by the socialist, nationalist, authoritarian superpower. The SNA, this socialist, nationalist, authoritarian bloc, challenged the dominant international system of CND bloc, but failed. Furthermore, the internal system of CNA bloc was changed. Thus, the end of the Cold War was the consequence of a global structural change in which the core bloc of CND model prevailed over the SNA counter model. Hence, the triumphant self-congratulation of the end of history and the New World Order. So far, we have dealt with developed empires, whether early starter or late starter. Except for small powers in the north, the rest of the world, with a few exceptions, consisted of former colonies. Despite the qualitative difference in historical experience between the late starter empires and former colonies. The latter have tended, the former colonies have tended to adopt either the CNA model or the SNA model, capitalist nationalist authoritarian model or socialist nationalist authoritarian model, mainly because all of them have one characteristic in common: late starter vis-à-vis the dominant CND core bloc. Looking at the history of the modern world in terms of the structural change of international society, we can make the following observations. First, modern history can be considered as a process through which the core bloc of early starter CND regimes played a twofold, often contradictory role. On the one hand, it stimulated the development of late starter societies, but on the other, it constrained and even distorted the development of the latter. It is through this dual function that the CND bloc penetrated the rest of the world. Secondly, the penetration by the CND bloc first took the form of successive secession from the dominant international elite and regime structure under the old regime, ancient regime in Europe, and then in turn began to assume a dominant international position to transform the elite and the regime structure of the non-CND world. And this gave rise to the emergence of CNA and SNA models. And the decisive transformation was carried out through historic wars, including the World Wars and the Cold War. The impact for structural change of international society generated by the CND bloc took the form at the critical moment of history, took the form of historic wars, including the so-called World Wars and the Cold War. It must therefore be noted that the wars of historic importance were not the function of the mere geopolitical rise and fall of great powers, but were the indication of a more fundamental structural change through which non-CND regimes had been assimilated by or incorporated into the CND regime core bloc. Focusing on the dynamics of change in modern history, we can develop a perspective on world politics which is quite different from the state-centric realist paradigm. The latter is, as you know, predicated on the idea that the sovereign state is the basic unit which constitutes international relations. International relations are defined essentially as anarchy. This realist view is fundamentally static and unidimensional in the sense that it presupposes the persistence of the state system itself and deals merely with the mechanistic vicissitude of interstate geopolitical balance of power. Thus, it is incapable to account for global structural changes in history, such as the one we witness today. In other words, the question addressed to us today concerns not only the interpretation of the global change underway, but also the change in the conceptualization of historical change. Thirdly, the international penetration and expansion of the CND bloc did not proceed in a linear way, but had to face the statist nationalist resistance of the historically disadvantaged late starter regimes. The regimes of late starter societies reacted by resorting to the building of a strong state as the engine of developmental catching up and national independence. And the strong state was associated with authoritarianism, collectivism, ethnocentrism, and so forth. The irony of history is that in the context of the structure of global uneven development, the democratic development in the CND bloc almost of necessity gave rise to authoritarian development in other societies. Fourthly, it should by now be clear that since the 18th century, the CND regime bloc has played the active role of the primary engine of global structural change. And while the CND regime bloc consisted of state nations, capitalism generated the trend towards internationalization, and democracy towards the perpetual process of deepening democratization. And these are the two basic trends mentioned above that are at work today in promoting global transformation. Although the apparent globalization of the CND bloc model led to the notion of the end of history, in reality, history cannot come to an end with the globalization of the CND model because its dynamics comprises fundamental contradictions. First, while the capitalist development of necessity gives rise to uneven, unequal, and inequitable development, democracy is committed to equality and equity. While capitalist internationalization brings advantages to those who have capital, technology, knowledge, and other resources to profit from internationalization, which in turn makes the advantaged even more advantaged, the disadvantaged tend to fail to benefit from internationalization. So when we discuss globalization or internationalization, we should always ask globalization for whom to what and by whom. Those disadvantaged even suffer from it, often being more marginalized than ever, as illustrated by the indigenous peoples in various parts of the world. Secondly, capitalist internationalization, utilizing the resources at the disposal of the advantaged, normally proceeds much ahead of political democratization, which must rely on the mobilization of the disadvantaged. There is an inevitable time lag between the two. Thus, there are a number of instances which have demonstrated that the multinational capital penetrated the South prior to the growth and spread of democracy. And capitalism was coupled with ruthless authoritarianism, which was to be democratized at a later stage, involving enormous cost in terms of human rights. This applies to the newly industrializing economies model, so-called NICS or NIS model, particularly the successful Asian NIS, which are now regarded by the elite of an increasing number of developing countries almost as the model after the demise of the alternative state socialist model. Thirdly, the failure of a number of developing countries to emulate the NIS led to a disorganized economy characterized by the enormous disparity between the rich and poor, the poverty of the marginalized poor, whose human dignity and identity tend to be ensured only by religious fundamentalism, and the intensified conflict defined in terms of ethno-national imagined community over the resources that are in perceived short supply. Fourthly, even in successful needs, environmental degradation has gone from bad to worse as a result of the growth-first policy of the elite, the export-oriented depletion of natural resources, and the penetration of consumer culture promoted by multinational and local enterprises. Fifthly, although the CND bloc has penetrated almost every corner of the globe as a result of the demise of the state socialist bloc, there are regime and elite structures that still keep themselves impervious of the CND penetration. They are small in number, isolated, and even helpless, particularly in connection with the local conflicts to which they are a party with little support of the international community, like Iran-Iraq war or India-Pakistan conflict, and so on. It is precisely this helplessness that has driven them to build a nuclear fortress. Without it, the regime and elite structure in their views would have been transformed in accordance with the dictates of the CND model. The last phase of the global penetration of the CND bloc will have to confront a new challenge, nuclear proliferation. Against this background, it is clear that history cannot come to an end. It is true that modern history demonstrated that the expansion and penetration of the CND bloc model was irresistible, as shown by the defeat of the Axis powers and the collapse of the Soviet camp. History has entered a new phase in which the basic contradictions of the modern world have become all the more visible thanks to the very global triumph of the CND model, which has been the core of modernity. Indeed, the globalization of the CND model amounts to the formation of what one may call today the international community. It is therefore no accident, in my view, that the organizer of this roundtable has linked the international community with the emergence of world disorder. And to the extent the CND model has been globalized, its contradictions have also assumed the character of the global problematic. There seems to be an international consensus formed in the last couple of decades that the global problematic concerns the following four categories of value. First, peace and security. Second, development and social justice. Third, human rights and democracy. Fourth, ecological balance and resource conservation. The question is what the critical global problems in those issue areas are that stem from the fundamental contradictions that I have been talking about. And let me take up some issues which I think are fundamental problematic we face today. First, peace, what I would call peace disparity problematic. Fortunately, the greatest threat to humankind, the global nuclear holocaust, has receded as a result of the ending of the Cold War. The subsequent emergence of a unipolar world military order suggests that the decreased danger of nuclear war is a product not so much of the process in nuclear disarmament as the accession of the United States to the position of unrivaled nuclear hegemony. The New World military order is extremely hierarchical, reflecting the uneven development of industrialism and science technology in modern history. It is natural that this military order, which is highly unegalitarian, as exemplified by the nuclear non-proliferation regime, should face strong criticism and opposition. The danger of unequal order is that it gives plausible legitimation to the demand of subordinate powers for equality. Besides the danger of nuclear proliferation, there has been great difficulty in legitimating ban or restriction on the transfer of conventional arms. The apparently reasonable measures of arms transfer restriction against arms traffic to halt and reverse the militarization of the world has been opposed not only by the military-industrial complex of the North, but also by the regimes of the South on the grounds that the measures will perpetuate the North-South military disparity in addition to the economic inequality in terms of industrial development. It is due to this aspiration for reducing the military inequality that the regimes of developing countries, which became better off than before, have justified their policy of wasting their wealth by purchasing highly sophisticated, expensive modern weapons. Military disparity and economic disparity are the function of the uneven development of modern industrialism. All contradict this search for a more egalitarian, democratic international order. The desire for egalitarian military order can lead to a world where every nation is equally equipped, for instance, with nuclear weapons. But it may lead to a world where every nation is equally disarmed. The latter scenario will be feasible if only initiatives are taken by the advantaged for dismantling the arsenals of modern weapons, giving priority to a democratic world order rather than retaining the historically acquired privileges under this hierarchical world order. Another peace security issue involves what is generally called ethnic conflict or internal war. As the main form of conflict in the post-Cold War period, it is defined in terms of ethno-cultural or even civilizational clash escalated into an armed dispute. The underlying argument is that the East-West ideological conflict has been replaced by ethno-cultural conflict, which allegedly is existentially more deeply rooted in human conditions into which people were born than the ideological contest, which was essentially a matter of choice. There are, however, several questionable points in the argument that ethno-cultural groups of different cultures or civilizations are bound to generate conflict, to fight, and to kill each other. First, ethno-cultural difference is not the same as ethno-cultural conflict. The question that can rightly be asked is, under what conditions will groups of different culture come into conflict? and under what conditions will the conflict turn into violent conflict? The shift from difference to conflict and from conflict to armed conflict cannot be accounted for in terms of the cultural difference, which remains unaltered. Secondly, this ethno-cultural and civilizational determinism overlooks a number of instances where people of different cultural, religious, or civilizational backgrounds live together peacefully. Thirdly, the very idea that there is inevitable conflict or incompatibility among cultures is a reflection of a particular type of culture, which is characterized by monotheist universalism, like Christianity and Islam. Many polytheist cultures take a more or less eclectic attitudes toward other cultures and religions. For instance, in Japanese culture, as you know, the people take their babies or children at the time of birth or sometime later to Shintoist shrines. And lots of Japanese are now wedded at Christian church. And when they die, the funeral is conducted in the Buddhist tradition. So we are very eclectic. And so under these circumstances, we don't care too much whether there is additional religious component coming into our own culture. We can make accommodation without too much difficulty. Thus, cultural civilizational determinism is not a tenable scientific proposition, but is a political ideology designed to rationalize conflict in defense of one's interests, which are not cultural, but political and socioeconomic. The fact that most of the regional conflicts, so-called regional conflicts or ethnocides, took place in the poor developing countries in the south or the former state socialist regions, or under economic disorder and social anomie, indicates that the fundamental problems are under or maldevelopment, which brought about unequal and inequitable distribution of resources among and also within ethno-national group. And also, if we look at the process through which this so-called ethno-cultural or ethno-nationalist conflict develops, you will always find that it is initiated by a small group of people who have special interests or objectives in manipulating or in inflaming the ethno-nationalist feelings for their own purposes. It would appear that the ethno-national or civilizational conflict is a manifestation of the deeper contradiction between uneven development and subsequent exclusion of disadvantaged groups on the one hand, and the demand for equal rights and non-discriminatory distribution of resources on the other. Secondly, there is the problematic of development and democracy. Just as peace and security issues are closely interrelated with development issues, the latter, in turn, are interrelated with democracy and human rights issues. First, modern capitalist development has proceeded by giving rise to the disparity between the North and South, and also within the South and North. All late starter capitalism, including that of contemporary developing countries, sought economic growth at the expense of people's democratic participation. The political exclusion of workers and peasants made it even more difficult for them to attain a decent living standard through the existing institutional channels, hence a series of riots, revolts, and repressive countermeasures, including the universal practice of torture. To avoid enormous human cost involved, it is imperative to pursue an alternative, that is, democratic economic development. Another dimension of contradiction between development on the one hand and democracy and human rights on the other concerns the late starter underdeveloped societies exemplified by most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and some countries in the Caribbean. The people and children who are severely suffering from poverty, starvation, and malnutrition are so marginalized by world capitalist development that they are in effect dispensable and disposable according to the logic of world market economy. They can be forgotten by the North, whose aid to them extended during the Cold War has been diverted to the former state socialist countries that carried greater political and economic weight for the industrialized North. While exploitation is peripheralization by commission, this neglect is marginalization by omission. The problem will not be solved on the basis of the logic of capitalist market economy unless the logic of market is counteracted by the forces struggling for democracy and human rights. This is another area where alternative democratic economic development is badly needed from a global perspective. Thirdly, human rights, culture, population problematic. The issue of human rights has recently been conceptualized by a growing number of people in connection with the following two issue areas, culture and demography, respectively. First, the question posed by some non-Western regimes concern whether human rights are universal or essentially Western. There is no doubt that cultural relativism, which underlies this argument, has been quite useful to disclose and demystify the cultural imperialism of the West, which historically served to rationalize Western political and economic imperialism. At the same time, cultural relativism has often been used by non-Western regimes to rationalize the local oppression and authoritarian rule, infringing upon the rights and dignity of the local people. The concept of human rights as a universal standard, therefore, is a useful criterion for the critique of local tyranny, but it may provide a rationale for the penetration and imposition of Western values. These are the subtle dilemmas of cultural relativism. Without further going into the detail of epistemological argument, we can point out that while we must acknowledge that the value of cultural diversity and the universality of human rights have yet to be synthesized, it is increasingly recognized worldwide as almost self-evident that a culture which defies the basic needs and fundamental rights of its people cannot claim the right to cultural relativity. In other words, the universality of the rights to cultural relativity is an idea which has been advanced through the process of contemporary historical dialectics. In fact, it is one of the consequences of the struggle for a deepening of the idea of democracy and human rights that is underway on an increasingly universal scale. How much time do I have? You have 5 minutes. Okay. Well, since my time is limited, I will skip this discussion on demography, population issues. And the final point, in connection with the world problematic concerns environment and democracy. You may know that I always refer to democracy as the point of reference when I discuss those various fields or categories of global problematic. Development of industrial capitalism has increased the consumption of natural resources at almost an exponential rate, particularly since the 1960s when the East and South, as well as the West, embarked on the high rate of economic growth, as if it were a good in itself. Further, to the extent industrial growth was uneven, resource consumption was mainly devoted to the interest of the North. The North has been taking preemptive action vis-à-vis the South in depleting resources, raising the fundamental issue of the equitable allocation of the resources of the globe, which are the common heritage of humankind. This is another manifestation of the contradiction between uneven development and democratic world order. If the equitable allocation of resources will have to be achieved through the mechanical universalization of the present and prospective level of consumption of the North, however, an ecological catastrophe on a global scale is hard to avoid. The Ben-Samite maxim of the greatest happiness of the greatest number, which in effect was the ideology of the early phase of capitalist growth, premised on the perceived infinity of the environment, will turn out self-defeating. It should be clear that the limits to growth poses a fundamental challenge to the CND core block model, which has historically been associated with the liberal myths of modernity, which posits the harmony of the maximization of private interest and that of public interest. Here again, the triumph, so-called triumph of the CND model has made its contradictions all the more pronounced. In order to cope with the environmental crisis, the concept of democracy has to be deepened, adding to it a new dimension of ecological harmony, which concerns not the quantitative conditions, but the quality of democratic life, or democracy itself. This will probably call for a spiritual deepening, not the material improvement of civil society. Now I have discussed problems, and then the final area that I have to take up is who are the agents of change who will cope with those problems to bring about a more democratic world order. There are three kinds of conceivable agents: the state, citizens, and the United Nations system. First, the state. While the nature and magnitude of these problems have become global, the agents who deal with them remain essentially national. This incongruence between the global character of fundamental problematic and the state system, which provides a framework of response, is one of the salient features of today's world. And this incongruence has much to do with the structural components of the CND model. As mentioned before, industrial capitalism has been the primary engine of globalizing the problematic. Democracy, while promoting the transnational penetration of its ideology and movements, still remains primarily within the institutional framework of the sovereign nation state. Political democracy is largely a national democracy. This incongruence is a reflection of the deeper uneven development which is eroding the state system. First, as capitalism has incorporated the whole world into a single market economy, it has accelerated twofold erosion of the sovereignty of the state. On the one hand, the economy has gained globality transcending the nation state. On the other, the free market has attained within the individual state a higher degree of autonomy, making the state less important for the economic life in civil society. Secondly, political democracy, though predominantly within the framework of nation state, has posed a twofold challenge to the authority of the state. On the one hand, the state has turned into an instrumental mechanism to meet the welfare and human rights requirements of the people. On the other, with the diffusion of ideological coherence and mounting popular pressures for interest articulation, the political party has weakened its credibility and efficacy as a solid vehicle of national integration, giving rise to perpetual inability and instability of the political regime based on a precarious coalition of diverse interests. Thus, capitalism and democracy are eroding the old world order based on the state system, thus generating a world disorder. These dynamics of change, however, have taken contrasting forms depending on the structural context of transformation. In the North, erosion of the state system has been fairly compensated by the creation or strengthening of international organization. This is best illustrated by the European Union. Further, the forces of internationalization, regionalization in Europe have been counteracted by the movements for democratization, which are also expressing themselves through an international institution such as the European Parliament. The UN Security Council that is under the virtual control of the United States plus Britain and France, as well as G7 and NAFTA, all these are operated with the view to establishing an international order geared to the promotion of the northern regional interest. In the South, as tragically exemplified by sub-Saharan African states, and to a lesser extent by the transition states of the former socialist camp, the ruthless penetration of world capitalist market economy has brought about even the disintegration of the state. The disappearance of the traditional mutual aid community, exodus of peasants and proliferation of shanty towns, intensified disparity between the rich and poor, corruption resulting from the commodification of political power, mushrooming organized crimes, drug traffic, violence, genocide of the common people by armed gangs and disorganized army, deluge of refugees, all point to the incapacity of the state to maintain order and authority. Further introduction or imposition of a spurious multi-party system under the pressure of the Western and IMF political conditionality gave birth not to pluralistic democracy, but to the bloody rivalry of the plurality of ethnic groups, clans, and religious sects, and so on. This is not simply an ethno-national conflict. Conflict within ethno-national groups is equally intense. This is a disorder rooted in poverty, disparity, and scramble for resources. If the state is being debilitated as the main pillar of world order, we must examine the role to be played by non-state actors on the two levels, namely the people and international organizations. Then I come to the role to be played by transnational citizens. For the citizens of the North, the logical conclusion of the erosion of the state's sovereignty and authority is the reinforcement of citizen transnational network of human solidarity, in parallel with and with a countervailing force to the strengthening of intergovernmental organizations and multinational corporate market forces. Okay. As activities of a number of NGOs demonstrate, citizens' transnational solidarity is no longer a lofty ideal. It is a reality that has been cumulatively established. On many African scenes of tragedy, it has been the NGOs such as Doctors Without Borders who came to help the local people much ahead of the UN's peacekeepers or who are recruited from member states. Let me quickly move to the final category, that is the United Nations system, because I think this roundtable is focused on this topic. Since the issue areas on which the UN has primarily focused has been changing, reflecting the changing realities of the world, a brief historical summary of UN's role in defining its own role is in order. The history of the UN can be roughly divided into 4 phases. The first was from its inception to the early 1960s. The primary focus of concern was on peace and security. This was natural in view of the fact that the memory of the largest war in history was very vivid in the minds of the people. Further, the fear of another world war, a war of nuclear annihilation, was menacing all nations of the world. The second phase was the 1960s. The main focus was on decolonization and development, reflecting the crucial interests of the emerging nations in Africa and Asia. In the third phase, which began in the 1970s, environment and human rights came to the fore. And we are in the fourth post-Cold War phase, where peace and security re-emerged, coupled with human rights concern. This summary does not imply that each phase has preoccupied with specific issues to the exclusion of other issues. What is more significant beyond the shift of focus is the change in the way the relations between the issues were conceptualized. In the first phase, peace and security was considered the ultimate goal. Development was, of course, taken up, but it was done so because poverty was considered as a cause of war. Decolonization was dealt with because colonialism was considered as a cause of war. Human rights were seriously debated, but the underlying view was that the state whose regime violated human rights at home was likely to take aggressive policy abroad in violation of the rights of other nations. In short, decolonization, development, human rights were considered to be the prerequisites for or the means to the attainment to the ultimate goal end of peace and security. In the second phase, each began to be recognized as an end in itself. Decolonization, for instance, was considered a goal independent of peace. Hence, the endorsement by the United Nations of the armed struggle for national liberation in some parts of Africa. In the third phase, however, a critical review of development programs, such as UN Decades of Development, led to a new emphasis on environment and the quality of life, namely implications for the life of humanity, which in turn was linked with the concern about human rights. The catastrophic implications of the danger of nuclearism for the environment and the rights to survival of humanity were unmistakably revealed by the Chernobyl incident. Finally, there was a growing awareness that national liberation has not necessarily led to the liberation of the people. In other words, peace and security, national liberation, development, and environment, all of them began to be considered as a requisite for the realization of the ultimate goal, that is human rights. Oh, where is it? It's a different page. Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. But I'm sorry, I have been very bad in allocating the time for making presentation in the proper way. So I must come to the final remarks. The democratization of the world organization, which should be the agent, one of the agents of the creation of a democratic world order, is for the time being located, has to be carried out by the United Nations. But the democratization of the world organization, the UN, cannot be achieved by such measures as expanding the membership of the Security Council with or without veto, or even elevating the status of the General Assembly. In the final analysis, it is individual human beings, not the state, who can be the subject of democratic rights. The group right of national self-determination is important, but equality of nations is important because it is a necessary condition for fulfilling the equal rights of individual human beings, not the other way around. Through the direct participation of a sizable number of individual volunteers in UN operations for coping with world disorder, for which I have some suggestions, but I didn't have time to spell it out. These citizens will participate on their own will in the activities of the UN peace keeping operations, or what I would call UN Peace Corps operations for development and environment. Those citizens will gain greater voice in redefining the role to be played by the United Nations, particularly in the field as one of the key engines of the fundamental historical dynamics of the universalization and deepening of democracy. Thank you.
We're going to take a short 20-minute coffee break. That is 10 minutes and 59 seconds. Come back, if you would, at 3:30, okay?